I thought I knew what silence sounded like. 47 years of marriage teaches you every kind of quiet. The comfortable silence of Sunday mornings, the tense silence after arguments, the hollow silence when words fail you completely. But standing in my own doorway that Tuesday evening, I discovered a new kind of silence, the kind that screams. The key turned in the lock the same way it had thousands of times before. Same brass doorknob, worn smooth by decades of my grip. Same welcome mat that said "Home Sweet Home" in faded letters. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it 3 days ago when I decided I needed some time away to think, to breathe, to remember who Elena was beneath all the years of being wife, mother, and keeper of everyone else's happiness. I'd driven to my sister's cabin by the lake, where cell phone service was spotty and the only sounds were lapping water and wind through pine trees. For 72 hours, I'd sat on that old wooden dock, watching sunrise after sunrise, trying to understand why I felt so empty in a house full of people who were supposed to love me. I thought maybe distance would give me perspective, help me see that I was being too sensitive, too dramatic. Maybe I was imagining the growing coldness, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, the feeling that I'd become invisible in my own life. But the moment I stepped through that front door, carrying my small overnight bag and a handful of wildflowers I'd picked from the cabin's garden, I knew I hadn't been imagining anything at all. The house felt different. Not empty. There were voices coming from somewhere deeper inside, but different in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. The familiar smell of my lavender potpourri had been replaced by something else. Vanilla candles, maybe. The expensive kind my daughter-in-law Rachel preferred. The ones that cost more than I usually spent on groceries for a week. I set down my bag and followed the sound of laughter. Genuine, warm laughter that I hadn't heard in my own home for months. It was coming from the kitchen, and as I moved closer, the voices became clearer. My son Daniel's voice, deeper now at 32 than it had been when he was the little boy who used to help me bake cookies every Sunday. Rachel's voice, bright and animated in a way it never was when I was around. And a child's voice, my granddaughter Emma, giggling the way children do when they feel completely safe and loved. I should have called out, should have announced my return the way any normal person would. "I'm home!" Or, "Hello, everyone." But something held me back. Maybe it was the tone of their conversation, so relaxed and easy. Maybe it was the realization that they sounded happier than they ever did when I was present. Maybe it was simple curiosity about what my family was like when they thought I couldn't hear them. I paused at the kitchen doorway, still holding those wildflowers, still invisible to the people inside. Daniel was sitting at my kitchen table, the same oak table where I'd fed him countless meals, helped him with homework, listened to his teenage heartbreaks. But he looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. His shoulders weren't tense, his jaw wasn't clenched in that way it always seemed to be lately. He was actually smiling, playing some kind of game with Emma while Rachel prepared what looked like an elaborate dinner using my good china, the set I only brought out for special occasions. They looked like a family, a complete family, and I was standing outside of it, watching through glass that might as well have been a brick wall. Rachel was telling some story about her day at work, something about a difficult client that had Daniel laughing so hard he nearly knocked over his coffee cup. Emma was coloring in a book, her little tongue poking out in concentration the way children do when they're focused on something important. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so warm and normal, that for a moment I almost forgot I lived here too. That's when I noticed it. The refrigerator, covered with Emma's artwork and school photos, all the magnets and memories that accumulate in any family kitchen. But as I looked closer, my heart started beating faster. Every single photograph that had included me had been removed. The family portrait from last Christmas where I stood next to Daniel, both of us smiling, gone. The picture of Emma and me at the zoo, feeding giraffes, replaced with one of just Emma and Rachel. Even the silly snapshot from Emma's 5th birthday party last month, where I was helping her blow out candles, had been swapped for a different angle that showed only the birthday girl and her parents. I'd been erased, quietly, systematically, completely erased from the visual history of my own family. My hands started shaking, and one of the wildflowers slipped from my grip, landing on the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness of my world. But they didn't hear it. They were too wrapped up in their perfect little bubble to notice that the woman who had made all of this possible was standing 10 feet away, watching her own life happen without her. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to us. And please comment which city you're watching from. That's when I heard my husband Richard's voice from the living room, and everything became infinitely worse. He was talking to someone on the phone, his voice thick with emotion in a way I hadn't heard since his father died 5 years ago. "I just don't know what to do anymore," he was saying, and I could hear the tears he was trying to hold back. "She's been gone 3 days, and I feel like I can finally breathe again. The house feels peaceful. I know that makes me a terrible person, but I can't keep pretending everything's normal." My legs nearly gave out. I had to grab the door frame to keep myself upright as his words hit me like physical blows. 3 days. I'd been gone 3 days, and instead of missing me, instead of worrying about where I was or when I'd return, my family had been celebrating my absence. "The kids seem happier too," Richard continued, and I realized he must be talking to his brother Tom, the only person who would listen to this kind of confession. "Daniel's actually been coming around more, bringing Emma over every day. It's like they were avoiding the house because of her, because of me. My own son had been avoiding our home because I lived in it. I stood there in my own hallway, holding dying wildflowers, listening to my husband of 47 years tell someone how much better his life was without me in it. In the kitchen, my family continued their joyful dinner, completely unaware that the woman who had spent decades cooking in that kitchen, cleaning those dishes, making that house a home, was standing close enough to touch them and yet felt more distant than if she'd been on another planet. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just thoughtlessness or the natural drift that sometimes happens in families. This was deliberate. This was chosen. They had decided, without ever telling me, that their lives would be better if I simply wasn't in them. I backed away from the kitchen doorway as quietly as I'd approached it, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. But they didn't. They never heard me anymore, even when I was speaking directly to them. Why would they hear me now? When I was finally understanding that I'd become nothing more than background noise in my own life, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, each step feeling like I was walking through quicksand. The bedroom Richard and I had shared for over 4 decades, where we'd whispered dreams and fears and plans for the future, where we'd held each other through illness and loss, and the ordinary struggles that test every marriage. The room where I'd foolishly believed we were building something permanent together. Even here, evidence of my erasure was subtle but unmistakable. My reading glasses, usually left on the nightstand, had been moved to the dresser. The book I'd been reading, marked with a bookmark at chapter 7, was gone entirely. The small framed photo of us from our honeymoon, young and ridiculously happy on a beach in Florida, had been turned face down, as if the sight of my 22-year-old smile was too painful for him to bear. I sat on the edge of our bed, still clutching those wilted wildflowers, and tried to understand how I'd become a stranger in my own life. When had I stopped being Elena, the woman Richard fell in love with, and become just another burden to manage? When had my son stopped seeing me as the mother who'd sacrificed everything for his happiness and started seeing me as an obstacle to his perfect family? But even as my world crumbled around me, something deep inside refused to break completely. Maybe it was 47 years of marriage that had taught me to endure. Maybe it was the stubborn strength my own mother had passed down to me. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that I had survived too much to let this destroy me entirely. I wasn't going to disappear just because they wanted me to. I was going to watch. I was going to listen. And when the time came, I was going to choose exactly how this story would end. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, the way I had every day for the past 20 years. Richard was still sleeping, his breathing deep and peaceful in a way that used to comfort me, but now felt like another small betrayal. How could he sleep so soundly when our marriage was dissolving around us? How could he rest peacefully knowing he'd spent the evening before confessing to his brother that life was better without his wife? I slipped out of bed and went downstairs to make coffee, following the same routine I'd maintained for decades. 2 scoops for him, 1 for me. His favorite mug, the blue one Emma had painted for him at school, next to my plain white cup. Even in my pain, I couldn't break the habits of caring that had defined my role in this family for so long. But when Richard came downstairs an hour later, showered and dressed for work, he barely acknowledged the coffee waiting for him. No, good morning. No, how was your trip? No questions about where I'd been or why I'd left so suddenly. He picked up his mug, took a sip, and immediately frowned. "This is weak," he said, not looking at me. "You know I like it stronger than this." It was the same strength I'd been making his coffee for 47 years. The same 2 scoops, the same brewing time, the same careful attention to his preferences that had become as automatic as breathing. But suddenly, even this small gesture of care wasn't good enough. "I can make a fresh pot," I offered, reaching for his mug. "Don't bother," he said, dumping the coffee down the sink. "I'll pick something up on my way to work." He gathered his briefcase and keys, moving through our kitchen like I wasn't there. Like the woman standing in her bathrobe, holding her own cup of coffee with shaking hands, was just another piece of furniture he had to navigate around. "Richard," I said as he reached the door, "we need to talk." He paused, his hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "About what?" "About the phone call I overheard. About the photos removed from the refrigerator. About the fact that you seem happier when I'm not here. About how our son avoids this house unless I'm gone. About how I feel like I'm disappearing and no one seems to notice or care. About us," I said simply. "Elena, I'm late for work. Can we do this later?" But I knew later would never come. Later had been promised for months now, postponed and delayed, until it became clear that later was just another way of saying never. "When?" I asked. "When exactly would be a good time to discuss our marriage?" He sighed. The kind of exasperated sound you make when someone is being unreasonable, when someone is asking for more than they deserve. "I don't know, Elena. Maybe when you figure out what you actually want to say?" And then he was gone, leaving me standing in my kitchen with coffee growing cold in my hands and the echo of his dismissal ringing in my ears. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Daniel's number flashed on the screen, and for a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe he was calling to check on me. Maybe he'd noticed I'd been away and wanted to make sure I was okay. "Hi, honey," I answered, trying to keep the hope out of my voice. "Mom, is Dad there?" Not, "How are you?" Not, "I missed you." Just a request for someone else. "He left for work already. Is everything okay? I need to talk to him about this weekend. Rachel's parents are coming to town and we want to have them over for dinner. But Dad mentioned you might be difficult about having people over." Difficult. The word hit me like a slap. When had I ever been difficult about having people over? I was the one who cooked elaborate meals for Richard's business associates, who cleaned the house until it sparkled before every family gathering, who smiled and served and made sure everyone felt welcome even when I was exhausted. "I've never been difficult about having people over," I said carefully. "In fact, I'd love to meet Rachel's parents. I could help cook. That's exactly what I mean." Daniel interrupted. "You always want to take over. Rachel wants to handle the dinner herself. She's been planning the menu for weeks." Take over. When had helping become taking over? When had decades of experience cooking for this family become something to be pushed aside and dismissed? "I was just offering to help," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "Look, Mom, maybe it would be better if you made plans to be out that evening. Go visit Aunt Sarah or something. Dad thinks it might be less stressful for everyone." Dad thinks. My husband had been discussing my presence at family gatherings with my son, and they'd both decided I was the problem. They'd both agreed that family events were better without me. "Daniel, this is my home too. I know that, Mom. But Rachel is really nervous about meeting her parents, and she just wants everything to go smoothly. You understand, right?" What I understood was that my daughter-in-law's comfort was more important than my right to exist in my own house. What I understood was that my son was asking me to exile myself so his wife wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience of acknowledging my existence. "How long has this been going on?" I asked quietly. "What do you mean? How long have you and your father been planning family events around my absence?" There was a pause. long enough that I knew my question had hit its mark, long enough for me to understand that this wasn't the first time they'd discussed the problem of Elena. "Mom, you're being dramatic. It's just one dinner." But it wasn't just one dinner, and we both knew it. It was Christmas Eve when Rachel had insisted on hosting at their apartment instead of our house, claiming our dining room was too formal. It was Emma's birthday party when I'd arrived to find that my gift had been set aside unopened while everyone else's presents were displayed prominently. It was Easter dinner when Daniel had called to say they'd decided to go to Rachel's mother's house instead, giving me less than 2 hours' notice. One by one, I was being edited out of the important moments. One by one, the traditions I'd spent decades creating were being transferred to other people, other places, other women who hadn't earned the right to them through years of sacrifice and love. "I'll make other plans," I said finally. Because what else could I say? What other choice did I have when my own son was asking me to disappear? "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand." But I didn't understand. I didn't understand how the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms had grown into a man who found my presence inconvenient. I didn't understand how the child I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, supported through every disappointment, and celebrated with through every triumph, could now speak to me like I was a problem to be managed. After he hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to remember the last time Daniel had called just to talk to me. Not to ask for something, not to relay a message from Rachel, not to discuss logistics or schedules, but simply to hear my voice because he missed me. I couldn't remember. Later that afternoon, Rachel called. This surprised me because Rachel never called me directly. Usually, any communication went through Daniel, as if speaking to me directly might somehow contaminate her. "Elena, it's Rachel. I hope you don't mind me calling." Her voice was different, warmer, more personal than usual. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wanted to extend an olive branch. Maybe she'd realized how she'd been treating me and wanted to make amends. "Of course not, dear. What can I do for you?" "Well, I was wondering if you might have some family recipes you could share with me for the dinner this weekend. I know how much Daniel loves your cooking, and I want to make something special for my parents." My recipes. The ones passed down from my mother and grandmother, refined over decades of cooking for this family. The secret to my famous pot roast that Richard always bragged about to his colleagues. The apple pie recipe that had made every birthday and holiday special for 30 years. "I'd be happy to share some recipes," I said carefully. "Oh, wonderful. Could you email them to me? I'm thinking maybe the pot roast and that amazing pie you make. My parents love traditional cooking. Traditional cooking. As if my decades of experience were just quaint traditions rather than skills earned through years of practice and refinement. Of course. But Rachel, if you'd like, I could come over and show you." "Oh no, that's okay. I learn better from written instructions. And besides, I want this to be my gift to Daniel's family. You know how it is. I knew exactly how it was. She wanted my recipes, my knowledge, my expertise. But she didn't want me. She wanted to take what I'd spent years perfecting and present it as her own creation, erasing my contribution while benefiting from my experience. "I'll send them over this evening," I said. "Thank you so much, Elena. You're such a sweetheart." A sweetheart. The kind of dismissive endearment you use for helpful neighbors or friendly cashiers. Not for the woman who taught your husband how to cook, who spent countless hours in that kitchen creating the meals that became his comfort foods, who established the traditions you were now claiming as your own. That evening, I sat at my computer and typed out those recipes, each one a small piece of my identity being packaged up and handed away. I included every detail, every trick I'd learned through trial and error, every substitution that made the difference between good and perfect. As I typed, I remembered teaching these same recipes to Daniel when he was 12 and wanted to surprise his father for Father's Day. I remembered the flour on both our faces, the way we laughed when the first attempt at pie crust crumbled, the pride in his eyes when he presented that slightly lopsided but perfectly delicious pie to Richard. Now, those memories, those moments of connection between mother and son, were being rewritten. Soon, when Emma asked where the family recipes came from, she'd be told they were Rachel's creations. My legacy in this family was being erased one tradition at a time. I sent the email at 9 p.m., then sat in my kitchen, the kitchen where I'd created all those memories, and wondered if this was how people disappeared. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly, until one day they looked around and realized no one remembered they had ever existed at all. Outside, I could hear the neighbors' children playing in their backyard, their laughter carrying through the evening air. It reminded me of when Daniel was young, when our backyard was full of birthday parties and sleepovers and all the beautiful chaos of a house where children felt loved and welcome. Now our house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when the people who are supposed to fill it with love and laughter have decided they'd rather create their joy somewhere else, with someone else, far away from the woman who had made it all possible in the first place. The weekend of Rachel's dinner party arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, the kind of October day that used to fill me with joy because it meant cozy evenings, warm meals, and family gatherings around our dining room table. But this year, autumn felt like an ending rather than a beginning. I'd made arrangements to visit my sister Sarah, as Daniel had suggested. No, as he'd insisted. Sarah lived an hour away in a small apartment that smelled like vanilla candles and old books, and she'd been surprised when I called asking if I could spend Saturday evening with her. "Of course, honey," she'd said, her voice immediately concerned. "But isn't this the weekend Daniel was bringing Rachel's parents over? I thought you'd want to be there for that." I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth, that my own son had asked me to leave so his wife could play hostess in my house using my recipes. Instead, I mumbled something about giving the young couple space to host on their own, as if this exile had been my idea. But Saturday morning, as I was packing my overnight bag, guilt crept in. These were Rachel's parents, people I'd never met who would be sitting at my dining room table, eating food prepared from my recipes, forming their first and possibly only impression of our family. Shouldn't I at least try to be part of that? Maybe Daniel had been hasty. Maybe Rachel had changed her mind. Maybe if I approached this differently, with more enthusiasm and less hurt feelings, we could find a way to make it work for everyone. I decided to stop by the grocery store and pick up flowers for the table. A peace offering, a small gesture that might smooth over any awkwardness. I chose a beautiful autumn arrangement, chrysanthemums in rich golds and deep reds that would complement the china I was sure Rachel would be using. My china, actually, the set my mother had given me for my wedding, but that seemed like a petty distinction to make. When I arrived at the house at 3 in the afternoon, 6 hours before the dinner party was scheduled to begin, I found Rachel's car in the driveway alongside one I didn't recognize, a silver sedan with out-of-state plates. My heart sank as I realized her parents had arrived early, which meant the introductions I'd hoped to make on my own terms would now happen in the middle of whatever preparations were underway. I used my key to enter through the front door, calling out cheerfully, "Hello, I brought flowers." The response was immediate and devastating. Silence fell over the house like a heavy blanket, the kind of quiet that comes when people are caught doing something they shouldn't be. Then I heard rapid footsteps and hushed voices, the sound of people scrambling to manage an unexpected situation. Rachel appeared first, emerging from the kitchen with flour on her apron and panic in her eyes. Behind her came a woman in her 60s with carefully styled silver hair and the kind of understated jewelry that spoke of quiet wealth. This had to be Rachel's mother, and the expression on her face suggested she'd been told something about me that wasn't particularly flattering. "Elena," Rachel said, her voice artificially bright. "I thought you were visiting your sister today." "I am," I said, holding out the flowers, "but I wanted to drop these off for your dinner party. And I'd love to meet your parents." The older woman stepped forward with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Elena. I'm Patricia Whitman, Rachel's mother. How nice to finally meet you." Finally, meet me. As if she'd been waiting for this introduction. As if Rachel had been promising for months that we'd eventually cross paths. But something in her tone suggested otherwise. Something in the way she looked at me, taking in my casual clothes and slightly wind-blown hair, suggested she'd been told exactly what to expect from Richard's first wife. First wife. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't Richard's first wife. I was his only wife. We'd been married for 47 years. But somehow, in the narrative Rachel had constructed for her parents, I'd been relegated to the status of an ex-wife, a previous chapter in Richard's life, rather than the woman who still shared his bed and his home. "It's wonderful to meet you too," I managed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "I hope you're enjoying your visit." "Oh, we are," Patricia said, her smile becoming more genuine as she looked around our living room, the room I'd decorated and maintained for decades. "Rachel has created such a lovely home here. So warm and inviting. You can tell she has such good taste." Such good taste. As she admired the curtains I'd sewn by hand, the family photos I'd arranged on the mantelpiece, the furniture I'd chosen piece by piece over years of careful saving. Every compliment felt like another small death, another piece of my identity being attributed to someone else. "Where's Daniel?" I asked, desperate to change the subject. "He's out back with my father," Rachel said quickly. "They're discussing some investment opportunities. Dad's been so impressed with Daniel's business sense." Through the window, I could see my son in animated conversation with a distinguished-looking man in an expensive golf shirt. They were sitting at the patio table I'd bought last spring, drinking what looked like good whiskey from glasses I didn't recognize. Everything about the scene suggested established relationships, ongoing conversations, a level of familiarity that spoke of previous visits and shared interests. "How long have you been visiting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Rachel and her mother exchanged a quick glance, the kind of look that passes between people who share a secret they're not sure they should reveal. "This is our third trip this year," Patricia said finally. "We try to come every few months to see Emma. She's growing up so fast, and we don't want to miss these precious years. Third trip this year. I'd lived in this house for over 40 years, and I'd never heard about any of these visits. My granddaughter had been spending time with these people, developing relationships with them, while I remained completely unaware of their existence." "That's wonderful," I said, though the word felt like ash in my mouth. "I'm sorry I missed your other visits." Another glance between mother and daughter, this one more uncomfortable than the last. "Well," Rachel said carefully, "the other visits were just quick weekend trips. Very low-key. We didn't want to impose on your routine. But this wasn't low-key. This was a formal dinner party with china and flowers and investment discussions. This was the kind of family gathering that should have included the actual family, not just the carefully curated version that Rachel preferred to present." "Elena, dear," Patricia said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone people use when they're about to deliver unwelcome advice. "Rachel tells me you've been having some difficulty adjusting to the changes in Daniel's life. It's so hard when our children grow up and start their own families, isn't it?" Difficulty adjusting, as if my pain at being excluded was some kind of psychological failing rather than a natural response to systematic rejection. "I think there might be some misunderstanding," I began. "Oh, there's no misunderstanding," Patricia interrupted gently. "It's perfectly natural. When Rachel married our son-in-law, his mother went through the same thing. Some women just have a harder time letting go. But eventually she learned to step back and let Rachel take her proper place in the family. Take her proper place. As if there were only room for one woman in Daniel's life. As if loving him meant I had to surrender my role as his mother to make space for his wife. "I don't think I need to step back from my own son," I said, my voice stronger than I'd intended. Rachel jumped in quickly, her tone soothing but firm. "Of course not, Elena. But you have to understand. Things are different now. Daniel has his own family to consider, his own priorities. It's important that you respect the boundaries we've established." Boundaries. When had loving my son become something that required boundaries? When had being his mother become an intrusion that needed to be managed and contained? "What boundaries?" I asked. "Well," Rachel said, glancing at her mother for support, "like giving us space to host our own gatherings. Like understanding that Daniel's primary loyalty is to his wife and daughter now. Like accepting that some family traditions might need to evolve. Evolve. Such a gentle word for the systematic erasure of everything I'd built, everything I'd contributed, everything I'd sacrificed to create the foundation that had made their happiness possible. At that moment, Emma came running in from the backyard, her face flushed with excitement from whatever game she'd been playing with her grandfather. When she saw me, her expression shifted to confusion. "Grandma Elena?" What are you doing here? Mommy said you were going away for the weekend. I just stopped by to say hello, sweetheart, I said, kneeling down to her level. And to meet your other grandparents. Emma looked from me to Patricia, her 6-year-old mind working to understand the dynamics at play. Grandma Patricia brought me a new doll, she announced. She's in my room. Do you want to see her? I'd love to, I said. But before I could stand up, Rachel intervened. Actually, Emma, Grandma Elena can't stay long. She has other plans today. But I want to show her my doll. Maybe next time, sweetie. Grandma Elena is very busy. Very busy. As if my life were so full of important activities that I couldn't spare 10 minutes to look at my granddaughter's new toy. As if spending time with Emma was an inconvenience I could barely fit into my schedule rather than the highlight of any day when it was allowed to happen. Emma's face fell, and I felt something crack inside my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about my granddaughter learning that some grandparents were welcome and others were not. That some family relationships mattered and others were disposable. It's okay, Emma, I said, forcing a smile. We'll see each other very soon. But as I said the words, I realized I wasn't sure they were true. I wasn't sure when I'd see Emma again, or under what circumstances, or whether the next time would involve more careful choreography to ensure I didn't interfere with the family narrative Rachel was constructing. I placed the flowers on the coffee table and gathered my purse, my dignity hanging by threads but still intact. As I moved toward the door, I heard Patricia whisper to Rachel, just loudly enough for me to catch, "You're handling this beautifully, dear. It's never easy, but you're doing exactly the right thing. The right thing. Excluding a grandmother from family gatherings was the right thing. Erasing a mother from her son's life was the right thing. Treating 47 years of marriage and motherhood as an inconvenience to be managed was the right thing." I drove to Sarah's house in a haze of disbelief, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I replayed every word, every look, every subtle cruelty I'd just endured. By the time I reached my sister's apartment, I was crying so hard I could barely see to park the car. That night, as I lay on Sarah's pull-out sofa, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood where I didn't belong, I finally understood what was happening to me. I wasn't just being excluded from family events. I was being rewritten, my role in this family's story edited down to nothing more than an inconvenient footnote. But somewhere in the darkness, beneath the pain and humiliation, something harder began to crystallize. I might not be able to control how they saw me, but I could control how this story ended, and I was beginning to understand that it was time to write my own conclusion. The weeks that followed the dinner party blurred together like watercolors in the rain. I moved through my days in a haze of numbness, going through the motions of living while feeling increasingly disconnected from my own existence. Richard and I shared the same house, the same bed, even the same breakfast table. But we might as well have been strangers passing in an airport terminal. He'd stopped making eye contact during our rare conversations, which had dwindled to discussions about grocery lists and utility bills. When I tried to bring up what had happened at the dinner party, how I'd felt excluded and humiliated, he'd dismiss my concerns with a wave of his hand. "You're being too sensitive, Elena. Rachel's parents seem like nice people. Maybe if you'd made more effort to connect with them instead of making everything about yourself, making everything about myself, as if wanting to exist in my own family was some kind of narcissistic demand rather than a basic human need." The phone calls from Daniel stopped altogether. No more requests for family recipes. No more logistical discussions about holidays. No more casual check-ins that had at least maintained the pretense of a relationship. When I called him, the conversations were brief and stilted, filled with awkward pauses and his obvious eagerness to end the call. "I'm really busy with work, Mom. Can I call you back later?" But later never came. The callbacks were forgotten, the promises to visit evaporated, and slowly I began to understand that I was being trained to stop reaching out entirely. Each unreturned call was a lesson in my new place in the family hierarchy, which appeared to be nowhere at all. Emma's 7th birthday was approaching in November, and I spent days planning what had always been one of my favorite traditions. For 6 years, I'd hosted her birthday parties in our backyard, transforming the space into whatever magical theme she'd requested. Princess castles built from cardboard boxes, treasure hunts with hand-drawn maps, elaborate tea parties with all her dolls invited as guests. This year, she'd mentioned wanting a superhero theme, and I'd already started collecting red and blue decorations, planning games where all the children could feel like heroes. I'd sketched out a cake-making station, researched recipes for a cake shaped like her favorite comic book character, even found a local performer who did superhero appearances at children's parties. When I called Daniel to discuss the details, his response was like a physical blow. "Actually, Mom, we've decided to have Emma's party at Chuck E. Cheese this year. Rachel thinks it'll be easier, and Emma's really excited about it." Chuck E. Cheese. A loud, chaotic chain restaurant with plastic decorations and processed food, where birthday parties happened assembly line style with no personal touches or family traditions. Where my granddaughter would celebrate turning 7 surrounded by strangers and video games instead of the love and creativity that had made her previous birthdays magical. "But we always have her party here," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "She loves the themes we create together. Remember last year when we turned the living room into an underwater kingdom?" "She's getting older, Mom. Kids her age prefer parties with their friends rather than family celebrations. It's more normal this way." Normal? The word hit me like a slap. Nothing about our family felt normal anymore, but apparently the solution wasn't to address the problems. It was to exclude me from the celebrations entirely. "Can I at least come to the party? I could help with—" "It's going to be really crowded, and Rachel's already worried about managing all the kids. Maybe you could take Emma out for a special birthday lunch the week after? Just the two of you? A consolation prize. A separate, smaller celebration to replace the real one I was no longer welcome at. My granddaughter's 7th birthday, and I was being offered table scraps from the feast of her childhood." "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? "That sounds lovely." But it didn't sound lovely. It sounded like another small death, another tradition torn away, another piece of my identity as Emma's grandmother being carved off and discarded. That evening, I sat in Emma's room, the room that had been Daniel's when he was a boy, where I'd read bedtime stories and sung lullabies and kissed away the fears that seemed so enormous in the darkness. The walls still held traces of his childhood, faded marks where superhero posters had hung, a small dent from the time he'd thrown a baseball indoors, height marks on the doorframe documenting his growth from toddler to teenager. I'd kept this room as a shrine to his childhood, even after he'd grown up and moved away, unable to bear the thought of erasing those memories. But when Emma was born, I'd slowly transformed it into a space that honored both generations. His old bookshelf now filled with her picture books, his desk converted to an art station where she could color and create. Now I looked at the room with different eyes, seeing it as evidence of my own foolishness. All those years of preserving memories that apparently meant nothing to anyone but me. All that careful curation of a family history that was being systematically rewritten without my input. I picked up one of Emma's drawings from the desk, a stick figure family she'd created during her last visit. There was Mommy with long yellow hair, Daddy with his business suit, and Emma herself in the middle with a big smile. At the edge of the paper, barely visible and drawn much smaller than the others, was another figure labeled Grandma Elena, in Emma's careful printing. Even in her 6-year-old artwork, I was an afterthought, a minor character pushed to the margins of the family portrait. The tears came then, finally and completely, as if a dam had burst inside my chest. I cried for the birthday parties I wouldn't host, for the bedtime stories I wouldn't read, for the memories I wouldn't be allowed to create with my granddaughter. I cried for the daughter-in-law who saw me as a threat rather than an ally, for the son who'd forgotten that love isn't a finite resource that must be rationed and divided. But most of all, I cried for the woman I used to be, confident, capable, necessary, the woman who'd believed that being a good mother and wife was enough, that love and sacrifice would be recognized and valued, that the family she'd spent decades nurturing would always have a place for her at the table. That woman was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone who apologized for taking up space, who accepted crumbs instead of demanding the respect she'd earned, who'd learned to make herself smaller and quieter until she was barely visible even to herself. I must have fallen asleep in Emma's room, because I woke up hours later to find Richard standing in the doorway. For a moment I thought he'd come looking for me, concerned about my absence from our bed. For a moment, I hoped he'd sit down beside me and ask what was wrong, the way he used to when we were young and believed we could solve any problem as long as we faced it together. Instead, he stood there looking uncomfortable, as if he'd discovered an intruder in his house. "What are you doing in here?" he asked. "I was just remembering," I said, struggling to sit up on the small bed where I'd curled up like a child seeking comfort. "Elena, this is getting out of hand. You can't keep dwelling on the past like this. It's not healthy. Not healthy. As if grief were a medical condition that could be cured with proper attitude adjustment. As if mourning the loss of my family relationships was some kind of character flaw, rather than a natural response to systematic rejection. I'm losing them, Richard. I'm losing Daniel and Emma, and I don't understand why." He sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion, and something that might have been pity. "You're not losing them. You're just having trouble adjusting to the fact that they have their own lives now. Their own family. Their own family." The phrase hung between us like a wall, separating me from the people I'd given everything to create and protect. "What about us?" I asked quietly. "What about our family?" Richard looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, something that looked almost like regret, but not quite like love. "I think," he said carefully, "that maybe we need to accept that our active parenting years are over. Daniel doesn't need us the way he used to. Maybe it's time to find other ways to fill our time. Other ways to fill our time. As if being a mother and grandmother were hobbies I'd outgrown rather than fundamental parts of my identity. As if 47 years of marriage had been preparation for this moment, when we'd politely step aside and allow younger people to take over the important work of loving our family. "Is that what you want?" I asked. "To just step aside?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft, I almost didn't hear him. "I want peace, Elena. I want to stop feeling like I'm constantly choosing sides between my wife and my son. I want to stop walking on eggshells in my own house. I want—" He paused, then continued with devastating honesty. "I want things to be easy for once. Easy. 47 years of marriage. And what he wanted most was for it to be easy. Not meaningful, not fulfilling, not even happy. Just easy." I understood then that I was fighting a battle I'd already lost. Not through any failing on my part, but through the simple passage of time and the cruel mathematics of family dynamics. There was only so much love to go around, and I was no longer considered worthy of my share. That night, after Richard had gone back to our bedroom and I'd finally forced myself to leave Emma's room, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands. The house was silent around me, but it wasn't the comfortable silence of a home at rest. It was the hollow silence of a space that had been emptied of its purpose. I thought about the woman I'd been at 25, so sure of my place in the world, so confident that love was enough to build a life on. I thought about all the dreams I'd set aside, all the opportunities I'd declined, all the pieces of myself I'd given away in service of a family that now seemed eager to continue without me. But as I sat there in the darkness, something unexpected happened. Beneath the grief and the despair, beneath the exhaustion of trying to hold on to people who no longer wanted to be held, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anger. Not the explosive, destructive kind of anger that burns everything in its path, but the quiet, steady anger of someone who'd finally reached the bottom and discovered it was solid ground. The kind of anger that could be shaped into something useful, something powerful, something that might actually change the story instead of just enduring it. For 47 years, I'd been Elena the wife, Elena the mother, Elena the grandmother. I'd defined myself through my relationships to other people, measuring my worth by how well I served their needs and supported their dreams. But maybe it was time to remember Elena the woman, Elena the individual, Elena the person who'd existed before all these roles and might still exist after they were taken away. I still had something they'd forgotten about, something they couldn't erase or appropriate or redistribute among themselves. I had my own story to tell. The anger didn't fade. Instead, it settled into something deeper, more purposeful than anything I'd felt in years. For days after that night in Emma's room, I moved through my routine with a new awareness, watching my family with the careful attention of someone who was finally seeing clearly after months of willful blindness. I began to notice things I'd been too hurt to observe before. The way Richard's phone conversations with Daniel grew animated and lengthy when he thought I wasn't listening. The way he'd lower his voice and move to another room when I entered, as if my presence contaminated whatever father-son bonding was taking place. The way he'd hang up quickly when I appeared, offering vague explanations about work stuff or just checking in. But these weren't quick check-ins. These were real conversations, filled with laughter and shared opinions, and the kind of easy intimacy that had been missing from our household for months. My husband and son were maintaining a relationship that deliberately excluded me, speaking freely only when I wasn't there to hear what they really thought. One afternoon, while Richard was in the garage organizing his tools with the obsessive precision that had always been his way of avoiding difficult conversations, I did something I'd never done in 47 years of marriage. I picked up the phone extension in our bedroom and listened to his conversation with Daniel. "She's getting worse," Richard was saying, his voice heavy with frustration. "Yesterday I found her sleeping in Emma's room. She's obsessing over every little change, turning everything into some kind of personal attack. I don't know what to do with her anymore." "Maybe she needs professional help," Daniel replied. "Rachel thinks she might be having some kind of breakdown. The way she acted at the dinner party, showing up uninvited and making everything awkward. Professional help. A breakdown. As if my natural response to being systematically excluded was evidence of mental instability rather than emotional health. As if the problem was my reaction to their cruelty rather than the cruelty itself. "I've been thinking the same thing," Richard said. "Maybe we could convince her to talk to someone, a therapist or counselor, someone who could help her understand that this behavior isn't normal. This behavior, wanting to be included in my family, wasn't normal behavior. Missing my son wasn't normal. Grieving the loss of traditions I'd spent decades creating wasn't normal. But what they were doing, the systematic erasure, the casual cruelty, the way they discussed me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved, that was apparently perfectly reasonable. I feel bad for her, Dad, but she's making it impossible for us to have any kind of normal relationship. Rachel's afraid to answer the phone when Elena calls because she always ends up feeling guilty about something. And Emma's starting to pick up on the tension. Emma was picking up on the tension. But instead of addressing the source of that tension, their deliberate exclusion of me, they were planning to pathologize my response to it. Instead of examining their own behavior, they were preparing to gaslight me into believing I was the problem. I hung up the phone as quietly as I'd picked it up, my hands steady despite the rage burning in my chest. They wanted to paint me as unstable? They wanted to suggest I needed professional help for the crime of loving my family too much? Let them try. That evening, I did something else I'd never done before. I went into Richard's study, his private sanctuary where he paid bills and managed investments and conducted the kind of important business that apparently couldn't be trusted to someone like me. And I began to examine our financial records. For decades, I'd allowed him to handle our money with complete autonomy. He was better with numbers, he said. He understood investments and tax implications and the complex financial planning that would secure our retirement. I'd trusted him completely, signing documents when he asked, accepting his explanations when I didn't understand, believing that his expertise was protecting our future. What I discovered that night changed everything. Our savings account, the one I'd been contributing to for 47 years with every spare dollar from my various part-time jobs, every tax refund, every small inheritance from deceased relatives, had been steadily depleted over the past 5 years. Not for emergencies or medical expenses or any of the legitimate reasons couples dip into their nest egg, but for regular transfers to an account I'd never seen before. I traced the paper trail with growing disbelief. Monthly transfers of $2,000, sometimes more, going to an account labeled Morrison Family Trust, a trust I'd never heard of, never been consulted about, never signed papers to establish. Further investigation revealed the truth that made my blood run cold. Richard had been systematically moving our money, my money, the fruits of my labor and sacrifice, into an account that named Daniel as the primary beneficiary. Not both of our children equally, which would have been natural and fair. Just Daniel. And more devastatingly, an account that required both Richard's and Daniel's signatures for any withdrawals. but not mine. I was the only person in this family who had no access to the money I'd helped earn and save. In the event of Richard's death, I would have no claim to resources I'd spent decades accumulating. Daniel and Rachel would inherit everything, while the woman who'd made it all possible would be left with whatever crumbs they chose to scatter. My husband and son hadn't just been planning my emotional exile. They'd been planning my financial exile as well. The next morning, I called the bank and requested a complete history of all accounts associated with our Social Security numbers. The customer service representative was helpful and thorough, walking me through records that painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation spanning years. Richard had opened credit cards in both our names, cards I'd never seen or used, with balances that explained why our household budget had grown increasingly tight, despite his steady income. He'd borrowed against his 401k multiple times, reducing the retirement fund that was supposed to sustain both of us in our final years. He'd even taken out a second mortgage on our house where I'd lived for 40 years, without my knowledge or consent. Mrs. Morrison, the bank representative said carefully, I need to point out that some of these transactions should have required both signatures. Are you saying you weren't consulted about these financial decisions? I wasn't just saying it. I was documenting it. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was thinking clearly instead of just reacting emotionally. That afternoon, I drove to a lawyer's office in the next town over, somewhere Richard would never think to look for me. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Patricia Chen, listened to my story with the kind of professional attention that made me feel heard for the first time in months. Elena, she said after I'd finished explaining my situation, what you're describing is financial abuse. Your husband has been systematically isolating you from resources that are legally yours. The fact that he's done this in coordination with your son makes it even more problematic from a legal standpoint. Financial abuse. I'd never heard the term before, but it fit perfectly. All those years of trusting Richard to manage our money while he made decisions that benefited everyone except me. All those times I'd accepted his explanations for why we couldn't afford things I wanted, while he was secretly funding Daniel's lifestyle. What can I do? I asked. Several things, Patricia said, pulling out a legal pad. First, we can demand full financial disclosure and freeze any accounts that were opened without your consent. Second, we can challenge the legitimacy of this trust that was established using marital assets. Third, we can explore whether you have grounds for divorce based on financial misconduct. Divorce. The word hung in the air between us like a door I'd never imagined opening. 47 years of marriage, and I was sitting in a lawyer's office discussing the end of everything I'd thought was permanent. I don't know if I want a divorce, I said honestly. I just want to understand what's really happening to my life. Understanding is the first step, Patricia said kindly. But Elena, I need you to understand something important. These aren't random betrayals or temporary lapses in judgment. What you're describing is a systematic campaign to eliminate you from your family's future. Financially, emotionally, practically. Someone has convinced your husband and son that their lives would be better without you in them. Someone. We both knew who that someone was, though neither of us said Rachel's name out loud. The question now, Patricia continued, is what you want to do with this information. You can confront them directly, which might lead to temporary improvements but probably won't address the underlying problem. You can continue accepting the situation and hope it improves over time, though based on what you've told me, that seems unlikely. Or you can start planning your own future independent of people who've decided you're expendable. Planning my own future. The phrase was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. For 47 years, my future had been inextricably linked to Richard's, to our families, to the assumption that we were building something together that would sustain us through whatever challenges arose. But what if that assumption had been wrong? What if I'd been building someone else's future while neglecting my own? What if the life I'd thought we were creating together had always been temporary from their perspective, a convenient arrangement that would last only as long as I remained useful and undemanding? That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Patricia's business card in my hand and a new understanding of my situation. I wasn't just a wife and mother going through a difficult period with her family. I was a woman who'd discovered that the people she'd devoted her life to serving had been actively working to remove her from the equation. But I had something they didn't expect me to have. I had information. I had legal options. I had a growing sense of my own worth that wasn't dependent on their approval or acceptance. And most importantly, I had time. Time to think, to plan, to decide exactly how I wanted this story to end. They thought they were managing Elena the problem, but they'd forgotten about Elena the woman, Elena the individual who'd existed before them and could exist after them if necessary. For the first time in months, I went to bed that night without crying. Instead, I lay awake thinking about possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. What would my life look like if I stopped trying to earn my place in a family that had already decided I didn't belong? What would I do with my days if I wasn't constantly attempting to prove my worth to people who'd chosen not to see it? What would Elena's story look like if Elena was the one writing it? The questions didn't frighten me the way they once would have. Instead, they felt like the beginning of something I'd thought was lost forever. They felt like hope. The change in me didn't happen overnight, but it was unmistakable. Where once I'd rushed to fill silences with nervous chatter, I now found comfort in quiet observation. Where once I'd desperately sought approval through endless acts of service, I now moved through my days with a purposefulness that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. I stopped making Richard's coffee in the morning, not out of spite, but because I realized I had better things to do with those precious first moments of each day than cater to someone who'd been planning my financial exile for years. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with my own cup, reading the newspaper and planning my own agenda. "Coffee's not ready," Richard said on the third morning of this new routine, standing in the kitchen doorway in his bathrobe with the confused expression of someone whose automatic systems had suddenly malfunctioned. "I made enough for one," I replied, without looking up from the financial section, where I was researching investment strategies and retirement planning for women over 60. "There's more in the cabinet if you'd like to make a fresh pot." He stared at me for a long moment, probably waiting for me to apologize and rush to correct this unprecedented lapse in my domestic duties. When I continued reading instead, he huffed and made his own coffee with the kind of exaggerated movements that suggested I was being unreasonable. But I wasn't being unreasonable. I was being intentional. Every small change was a deliberate step toward the woman I was becoming, the one who understood that service freely given was meaningful, but service extracted through guilt and obligation was just another form of servitude. I began spending my afternoons at the public library, not hiding from my family, but researching my options. I studied everything I could find about financial abuse, women's rights in marriage, and the legal protections available to wives who'd been systematically excluded from decision-making. I made copies of articles and printed out resources, building a file that grew thicker each day. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson who'd worked there for 30 years, noticed my regular presence and my focused research. "Writing a paper?" she asked one afternoon, noticing the stack of legal documents I was photocopying. "In a way," I said. "I'm researching my own life." She nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd seen many people come to the library seeking answers to questions they couldn't ask anywhere else. "The law section is in the back corner if you need more resources." "And Elena?" She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "The computers in the research room are more private if you're looking into sensitive matters." I thanked her and moved to the back corner, where I spent hours learning about things I'd never thought I'd need to know. Community property laws, financial disclosure requirements, the statute of limitations on challenging fraudulent transfers, the legal definition of constructive abandonment. That last phrase stuck with me. Constructive abandonment. When a spouse creates conditions so intolerable that the marriage becomes unbearable, even while remaining physically present in the home. It was a perfect description of what had been happening to me, though I'd never had words for it before. At home, my new behavior was creating ripples of confusion and concern. Richard kept looking at me sideways, as if trying to figure out what had changed but not quite able to identify the source of his unease. I wasn't angry or confrontational. I wasn't making demands or issuing ultimatums. I was simply present differently. When he complained about dinner being late because I'd been at the library, I nodded sympathetically and suggested he start cooking earlier if he preferred to eat at a specific time. When he mentioned that I seemed distant lately, I agreed that I'd been doing a lot of thinking and left it at that. When he asked what I was thinking about, I smiled and said I was exploring new interests. What kind of interests? He pressed, the way someone might probe a sore tooth to see if it still hurt. Legal studies, I said truthfully. I'm learning about financial planning and women's rights. It's fascinating how much I never knew about my own legal protections. The color drained from his face so quickly I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Why are you suddenly interested in legal matters? He asked, his voice carefully casual. Why wouldn't I be? At our age, it's important to understand these things. Retirement planning, estate issues. What happens to assets if one spouse becomes incapacitated? Don't you think it's wise for me to be informed about our financial situation? He mumbled something about having everything under control and escaped to his study, where I heard him making urgent phone calls behind closed doors. I didn't need to eavesdrop this time to know he was calling Daniel, probably seeking advice about how to handle his suddenly unpredictable wife. 2 days later, Daniel showed up unannounced, something that hadn't happened in months. I was in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds I'd planted and maintained for 20 years, when I heard his car in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched him enter the house and begin what appeared to be an intense conversation with his father. I continued my gardening, taking my time to properly prepare the beds for winter. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, about nurturing things that would bloom again next spring, regardless of whatever chaos was happening inside the house. These flowers didn't care about family drama or financial manipulation. They simply grew toward the light, season after season, with a resilience I was finally learning to emulate. After an hour, Daniel appeared at the back door. Mom, can we talk? I looked up from the chrysanthemums I was dividing, noting the careful tone he was using. Not quite concerned, not quite accusatory, but definitely wary. Of course, sweetheart. Let me just finish this section. I took my time completing the task, washing my hands at the outdoor spigot and gathering my tools with deliberate care. When I finally joined him on the back patio, he was sitting at the table where he'd eaten countless meals as a child, but his expression was that of a stranger trying to assess a potential threat. Dad says you've been acting differently lately, he began without preamble. Have I? In what way? He says you're spending a lot of time away from the house, researching things, legal things. I settled into the chair across from him, the same chair where I'd helped him with homework, and listened to his teenage heartbreaks and celebrated his achievements. I've been educating myself about financial matters. It seemed prudent. Prudent how? Well, Daniel, I realized I know very little about our family's financial situation. Your father has always handled those matters, but at our age, I thought it wise to become more informed. What if something happened to him? What if I needed to make decisions about our assets? Surely you'd want me to be prepared for those possibilities. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly having anticipated a different kind of conversation. Whatever script his father had prepared him with wasn't accounting for this calm, reasonable version of his mother. That makes sense, he said slowly. But Dad's worried that you're upset about something. He thinks maybe you're feeling left out of family decisions. Left out. Such a gentle way to describe systematic exclusion and financial manipulation. Do you think I should feel left out, Daniel? The question hung between us like a challenge he wasn't prepared to meet. I could see him wrestling with competing narratives. The story Rachel had been telling about his difficult, demanding mother, and the reality of the woman sitting across from him asking simple, direct questions. I think maybe there's been some miscommunication lately, he said finally. Some hurt feelings on all sides. What feelings have been hurt on your side? Another question he wasn't expecting. I could see him scrambling to identify grievances that might justify the treatment I'd been receiving. Well, Rachel feels like you disapprove of her. Like you're critical of the way she handles family situations. Have I criticized Rachel to you or to her directly? Not exactly, but have I said anything negative about the way she manages your household or raises Emma? No, but have I interfered with your marriage or tried to undermine your family decisions? Mom, this isn't really about specific things you've said or done. Then what is it about, Daniel? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands the way he used to when he was a child caught in a lie. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes that might have been shame. Rachel thinks. She feels like you want things to stay the way they used to be. Like you can't accept that I have my own family now. And what do you think? I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I think maybe we all need to find a new way to be a family. A way that works for everyone. A way that works for everyone. The diplomatic language of someone trying to avoid taking responsibility for causing pain, while also avoiding the work of actually addressing the problem. That sounds wise, I said. What would that look like to you? I don't know yet, but maybe we could start by having regular family dinners again. All of us together. And maybe Rachel and I could include you more in Emma's activities. Include me more. As if I were a neighbor asking for permission to attend my own granddaughter's events rather than a grandmother who'd been systematically excluded from them. I'd like that, I said, though we both knew these promises had been made before and quietly abandoned when they became inconvenient. Good. That's good, Mom. And maybe you could try to make Rachel feel more comfortable. She really wants to have a good relationship with you. There it was. The familiar refrain that made everything my responsibility. Rachel wanted a good relationship with me, but only on terms that required me to make myself smaller, quieter, less present in my own family. She wanted the benefits of having a mother-in-law without the inconvenience of actually dealing with one who had opinions, needs, or expectations. I'll certainly try, I said, because it was true. I would try, though perhaps not in the way Daniel expected. That evening, after Daniel had left and Richard had retreated to his study to avoid whatever uncomfortable conversation he thought might be coming, I sat in my living room and looked around at the life I'd built, the furniture I'd chosen, the photos I'd arranged, the books I'd collected, the plants I'd nurtured. Every corner of this house told the story of a woman who'd cared deeply about creating a home that reflected love and stability, and the hope that good things were permanent. But I was beginning to understand that nothing was permanent except the choice to keep creating, keep caring, keep believing in your own worth even when the people around you forgot to value it. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to Patricia Chen, my attorney. There were documents I needed to request, accounts I needed to investigate, and decisions I needed to make about my future. It wasn't anger driving me anymore, though the anger had been necessary to get me started. It wasn't even hurt, though the hurt had been real and valid and important to acknowledge. It was something quieter but infinitely more powerful. Self-respect. For the first time in decades, I was choosing Elena. Not Elena the wife, or Elena the mother, or Elena the grandmother, but Elena the individual woman who deserved to be treated with dignity and honesty by the people who claimed to love her. The woman who was finally ready to write her own ending. The moment came on a Thursday in December, exactly 3 weeks before Christmas. I'd been planning it for days, waiting for the right opportunity when all the pieces would fall into place naturally. Richard had mentioned that Daniel and Rachel were coming over to discuss holiday plans. Another family meeting I was expected to attend but not truly participate in. Another opportunity for decisions to be made around me rather than with me. I spent the morning at Patricia Chen's office, finalizing the documents that would change everything. Bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers. Loan documents signed without my knowledge. Evidence of the systematic financial manipulation that had been happening behind my back for years. Patricia had worked diligently to compile everything into a comprehensive presentation that told the story clearly and undeniably. "Are you sure you want to do this today?" Patricia asked as she handed me the manila folder that contained my family's financial secrets. "Once you share this information, there's no going back. They'll know that you know everything." "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time in months, I truly was. Not angry, not vengeful, just clear about what needed to happen. I've spent 47 years trying to hold this family together through love and sacrifice. It's time to see if truth can do what love apparently couldn't. I drove home through the early winter afternoon, snow beginning to dust the windshield in the way that made everything look clean and new. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside me like a passenger carrying its own weight of possibility. In a few hours, everything would be different. The careful pretenses would be stripped away, the polite fictions would be abandoned, and we would all have to face exactly what we'd become. Daniel and Rachel arrived at 5:30, just as the December darkness was settling over our neighborhood. I watched through the front window as they helped Emma out of her car seat, my granddaughter bundling against the cold in a puffy pink coat that made her look like a small marshmallow. Rachel carried a bottle of wine and what appeared to be a carefully prepared agenda for our evening discussion. Daniel had his laptop bag, suggesting this was indeed a business meeting rather than a family gathering. "Grandma Elena," Emma ran to me the moment they entered, wrapping her arms around my legs with the unconditional enthusiasm that children show before the world teaches them to ration their affection. For a moment, holding her small body against mine, I almost wavered, almost decided that preserving her innocence was more important than claiming my own dignity. But then I remembered Patricia Chen's words. Children learn about relationships by watching the adults around them. What is Emma learning about how women should be treated in families? "Hello, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to her level. "I'm so happy to see you. Are we going to decorate the Christmas tree tonight? Mommy said maybe we could start the decorations." I looked up at Rachel, who was avoiding my eyes while hanging her coat in the closet. "We'll see what everyone decides," I said carefully. Richard emerged from his study with the hearty enthusiasm he always displayed when he was nervous about something. "There's my favorite granddaughter. How's my Emma doing?" The evening began according to their usual script. Rachel unpacked what appeared to be a detailed holiday schedule, complete with color-coded spreadsheets showing which family would host which celebration. Daniel opened his laptop and began discussing the logistics of gift exchanges and travel arrangements. Richard nodded along with everything they proposed, playing the role of the accommodating grandfather who just wanted everyone to be happy. I sat quietly, listening as they planned Christmas Eve at Rachel's parents' house, Christmas morning at Daniel and Rachel's apartment, and Christmas dinner at the country club where Rachel's family held their annual celebration. My presence was mentioned only in logistical terms, whether I would drive separately or ride with Richard, whether I had any dietary restrictions the club needed to know about, whether I would prefer an early or late seating. I was being managed again, processed through their holiday efficiency like a piece of luggage that needed to be transported but not consulted. "This all sounds lovely," I said when they'd finished their presentation. "Very well organized." Rachel beamed with pride at having successfully orchestrated another family holiday that would run smoothly without requiring any real input from the inconvenient relatives. "Now," I continued, reaching for the manila folder I'd placed on the coffee table earlier, "I have something I'd like to discuss with all of you." The change in atmosphere was immediate. Daniel's laptop slowly closed. Rachel's smile faltered. Richard's face went pale as he recognized the folder. The same kind of folder he used for important financial documents. The kind that contained information rather than casual conversation. "What's that, Mom?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. "This," I said, opening the folder and removing the first document, "is a comprehensive record of our family's financial transactions over the past 5 years. Specifically, the transactions that have been made without my knowledge or consent." I placed the first bank statement on the coffee table where everyone could see it. Richard's face had gone from pale to gray, but he remained silent. Rachel looked confused, as if this topic had nothing to do with her. Daniel leaned forward to examine the document. "I don't understand," he said. "What transactions?" "Let me explain," I said, my voice calm and steady despite the enormity of what I was revealing. "This is a record of $147,000 that has been transferred from our joint savings account into something called the Morrison Family Trust over the past 5 years. A trust that I never knew existed, never consented to, and have no access to." Daniel's eyes moved from the document to his father's face, confusion beginning to shift into something else. "Dad? What is she talking about?" Richard cleared his throat, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "Elena? This isn't really the appropriate time or place to discuss our financial arrangements. Isn't it?" I asked mildly. "When would be the appropriate time to discuss the fact that my husband has been systematically moving marital assets into accounts that exclude me? When would be the right place to talk about the second mortgage he took out on our house without my signature?" I placed the second document on the table. Rachel's confusion was becoming alarm as she began to understand that this conversation might have implications for her own financial security. "Richard," she said sharply. What is Elena talking about? These are complicated financial matters, Richard began, but I interrupted him gently. They're not complicated at all, I said. They're quite simple, actually. My husband and son have been planning my financial future without me. They've created legal structures that ensure I have no access to money I helped earn and save. In the event of Richard's death, I would inherit nothing, while Daniel would inherit everything. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma, who had been coloring at the kitchen table, continued her work blissfully unaware of the adult world imploding around her. That's not... Daniel started, then stopped, looking at his father for guidance that wasn't coming. Let me show you more, I said, placing additional documents on the table. Credit cards opened in both our names that I never knew about. Loans against Richard's 401k that reduce both our retirement security. Investment accounts that require both Richard's and Daniel's signatures but not mine. Elena, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, you don't understand the full picture. Then explain it to me, I said. Explain why the woman who has been married to you for 47 years, who has contributed to our household financially and otherwise for 5 decades, who has never been irresponsible with money or made unreasonable financial demands, needs to be excluded from decisions about her own financial future. Rachel was staring at Daniel with an expression of growing horror. Not horror at what had been done to me, but horror at the possibility that her own financial security might be threatened by this revelation. Daniel, she said urgently, did you know about this? Daniel looked between his father and me, trapped between 2 versions of reality he'd never had to reconcile before. Dad said it was estate planning. He said it was to protect the family assets. Protect them from whom? I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like an accusation because we all knew the answer. Protect them from me. Protect them from the woman who'd spent decades building this family's financial foundation, who'd never taken more than her share, who'd sacrificed her own dreams and desires to support theirs. Elena, Rachel said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when she was about to explain something to someone she considered intellectually inferior. You have to understand that these kinds of financial arrangements are normal in families with significant assets. It's about tax planning and estate management. It's not personal. Not personal. The systematic exclusion of a wife and mother from her family's financial future wasn't personal. Rachel, I said, looking directly at her for the first time in months, how much of this was your idea? The color drained from her face so quickly that I had my answer before she could formulate a response. Elena, that's not fair, Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Let me ask you something, Daniel. When did these financial arrangements begin? When did your father start moving money into accounts I couldn't access? Daniel looked at Richard, who was staring at his hands as if they might contain answers to questions he couldn't face. When did you get married, Daniel? I continued. When did Rachel join this family and suddenly my financial security became something that needed to be managed and contained? That's enough, Rachel said, standing up with the kind of righteous indignation that people display when they've been caught in behavior they can't defend. You're making accusations without any evidence. I have plenty of evidence, I said calmly, gesturing to the documents spread across the table. What I don't have is an explanation that makes sense. What I don't have is a single good reason why the woman who made this family possible should be treated like a potential threat to its security. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece where our family photos were displayed. The pictures Rachel hadn't been able to remove because they were in my house, on my walls, telling the story of a life she was trying to rewrite. I built this family, I said, my voice still steady but carrying decades of accumulated truth. I carried Daniel for 9 months. Raised him for 18 years, supported Richard's career, maintained this home, contributed to our financial security, and asked for nothing in return except to be treated like I mattered. I turned back to face them, 3 adults sitting in my living room looking like children who'd been caught stealing from their grandmother's purse. Instead, I've been systematically excluded from financial decisions, emotionally marginalized in family gatherings, and treated like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be loved. And now I discover that this exclusion wasn't accidental or unconscious. It was planned. It was deliberate. It was legal manipulation designed to ensure that the woman who built this foundation would have no claim to what was built upon it. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then how was it supposed to be, Daniel? What was the plan for your mother's future? What role was I supposed to play in the family I created?" He had no answer because there had been no plan for me. I was supposed to disappear quietly, gratefully, without asking uncomfortable questions about my own rights or needs or value. But I wasn't disappearing. I was standing in my own living room, surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal, and for the first time in months, I felt completely, powerfully present. "I want you all to leave now," I said quietly. "Take Emma home. Discuss whatever you need to discuss about damage control and legal strategies and how to handle the fact that Elena finally knows the truth." "Elena, please," Richard began, but I held up my hand. "I'm done, Richard. I'm done pretending this is about my sensitivity or my inability to adjust to change. I'm done accepting crumbs from the table I set. I'm done being grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion you're willing to offer." I looked at each of them in turn. My husband of 47 years, my son who I'd loved more than my own life, my daughter-in-law who'd never seen me as anything more than an obstacle to overcome. "You wanted me to step back? Congratulations, you got your wish." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It wasn't the silence of people avoiding difficult conversations. It was the silence of people who'd just realized that the game they'd been playing had suddenly changed rules, and they no longer knew how to win. They left that night in stunned silence, gathering Emma and their belongings with the mechanical movements of people who'd just witnessed something they couldn't immediately process. Richard retreated to his study without a word, and I was finally alone in my house with the truth hanging in the air like smoke after a fire, acrid and unmistakable, but somehow cleaner than the lies that had been choking us all. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't collapse under the weight of what I'd just done. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my living room, looking at the documents still spread across the coffee table like evidence in a crime scene, which in a way they were. The next morning, Patricia Chen called before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. "Elena? Daniel called me at 7 a.m. He wants to schedule a meeting to discuss resolving this situation amicably." His exact words. I almost laughed. After months of being excluded from family decisions, suddenly they wanted to resolve things amicably now that I held cards they hadn't known I possessed. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that any communication regarding your financial affairs would need to go through me, and that we'd be happy to meet once he's retained his own legal counsel." He seemed surprised that this was now a legal matter, rather than a family discussion. Legal matter. Yes, it had become that. When love and respect and basic human decency failed, sometimes law was the only language people understood. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "I've been researching the trust documents more thoroughly, and I found something interesting. The way it was structured, with transfers from your joint marital account, makes it vulnerable to challenge. We can argue that marital assets were improperly converted to separate property without your consent." "What does that mean practically?" "It means you have a very strong case for recovering a significant portion of what was taken. It also means they know their position is legally weak, which explains why Daniel is suddenly interested in negotiating." I spent the morning gardening, pulling up the last of the winter vegetables and preparing the beds for spring planting. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, about clearing away what was finished and preparing for what was to come. My hands in the soil, the December sun warming my back despite the cold air, the simple rhythm of tending to growing things. It all felt like meditation, like prayer, like the most honest conversation I'd had with myself in years. Richard emerged from the house around noon, looking haggard and uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. He stood at the edge of the garden watching me work, as if trying to decide whether approaching me was safe. "Elena," he said finally, "we need to talk." I continued working, my hands steady as I divided perennials that had grown too large for their space. "I think we talked enough last night. Please give me a chance to explain." I looked up at him then, this man I'd loved for 47 years, and saw someone I barely recognized. The confident, decisive Richard who'd managed our finances and made our major decisions had been replaced by someone who looked lost and frightened. Explain what, Richard? Explain why you've been planning my financial exile for 5 years? Explain why you thought I didn't deserve to know about decisions affecting my own future? Explain why you discussed my mental health with our son instead of discussing your concerns with me directly. He flinched at each question as if they were physical blows. It wasn't supposed to hurt you, he said quietly. It was supposed to protect everyone. Protect everyone from what? From complications. From family conflict about money. From having to make difficult decisions about care if one of us became incapacitated. You mean, protect Daniel and Rachel from having to deal with me? He was quiet for so long, I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Rachel was worried about what would happen to the family assets if something happened to you first. She wanted to make sure Daniel's inheritance was protected. There it was. The truth I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe. My daughter-in-law had been so concerned about my potential claim on family assets that she'd convinced my husband to legally minimize my access to wealth I'd helped create. And you thought this was reasonable? I thought it was smart planning. Rachel understands finance and estate law better than either of us. She was looking out for the family's future. What about my future, Richard? What about the woman who'd been part of this family longer than Rachel has been alive? He had no answer for that because there had been no plan for my future. I was supposed to be grateful for whatever they chose to provide, accepting whatever arrangement they deemed appropriate for the inconvenient elderly woman who'd outlived her usefulness. That afternoon, Daniel called, not to apologize or explain, but to negotiate. Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the financial arrangements. Dad was trying to do estate planning, and maybe he didn't communicate it well, but his intentions were good. Daniel, I said calmly, your father transferred $147,000 of marital assets into accounts I can't access. He took out loans against our retirement without my knowledge. He created legal structures that would leave me financially vulnerable if he died first. What part of that represents good intentions toward your mother? But you'd still inherit the house and Social Security, and Dad's pension has survivor benefits. I sat down heavily, understanding finally the full scope of how little they valued my contribution to this family's success. In their minds, I deserved whatever scraps the law required them to provide, while everything we'd built together would flow to Daniel and his family. Let me ask you something, Daniel. If Rachel discovered that you'd been secretly moving money into accounts she couldn't access, if you'd been making major financial decisions without consulting her, if you'd been planning her financial future without her input, how do you think she'd respond? There was a long pause. That's different. How is it different? Because you and Dad have been married so long. Because you trust each other. Trust each other? Daniel, I trusted your father completely, and he used that trust to exclude me from decisions about my own life. How is that different from what would be devastating betrayal in any other marriage? I could hear him struggling with concepts that challenged the narrative he'd constructed to justify their treatment of me. What do you want, Mom? What would it take to resolve this? What did I want? The question hung in the air while I considered all the possible answers. I wanted the last 5 years back, when I'd still believed I mattered to the people I loved most. I wanted the family relationships I'd thought were permanent and unshakable. I wanted to be grandmother to Emma in the way I'd always imagined, present for her childhood and adolescence and young adulthood. But I couldn't have any of those things because they required other people to choose differently, to value me differently, to love me in ways they'd proven they were incapable of sustaining. I want dignity, I said finally. I want to be treated like a human being whose thoughts and feelings and rights matter. I want honesty instead of manipulation. I want respect instead of management. But practically, Mom, what would that look like? Practically. Always back to the practical questions, as if human dignity were just another problem to be solved with the right financial arrangement. Practically, Daniel, it would look like a family that included me in decisions instead of making them around me. It would look like a daughter-in-law who saw me as a person, rather than an obstacle. It would look like a husband who respected me enough to discuss our financial future instead of secretly restructuring it. "We can do that," he said quickly. "We can include you more. We can make sure you're part of family decisions." But we both knew those were empty promises. They'd offered inclusion before, then quietly withdrawn it when it became inconvenient. They'd made these commitments in moments of crisis, then forgotten them when the immediate pressure was relieved. "It's too late for that, Daniel." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't want to be included in a family that sees my presence as a burden to be managed. I don't want to fight for scraps of respect from people who should offer it freely. I don't want to spend whatever years I have left trying to earn my place among people who've already decided I don't really belong." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of us was ready to discuss directly. 3 days later, I met with Patricia Chen to finalize the legal documents that would reshape my future. We'd negotiated a settlement that returned the majority of the transferred funds to accounts I could access independently. Richard would retain ownership of the house, but I would receive enough liquid assets to purchase my own home and live comfortably for the rest of my life. "You could fight for more," Patricia said as we reviewed the agreements. "You could demand half of everything, including the house. You have grounds for a very aggressive legal action." "I don't want to destroy them," I said. "I just want to be free of them." That evening, I called my sister Sarah and asked if I could visit for an extended stay while I looked for a new place to live. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Of course. But Elena, what's happening? Are you and Richard having problems?" "We're getting divorced," I said. And saying the words out loud felt like stepping through a doorway into a country I'd never seen before. I found a small house near Sarah's neighborhood, a charming cottage with a garden that needed work and enough bedrooms for guests. The mortgage payment was manageable on my newly independent income, and for the first time in decades, every financial decision was mine alone. Richard moved out 3 weeks before our divorce was finalized. We handled the transition with the polite efficiency of business partners dissolving a company rather than spouses ending a marriage. There were no dramatic confrontations, no passionate reconciliation attempts, no final declarations of love or regret. On the day he left, carrying the last of his belongings to his new apartment, he paused at the front door. "Elena, I hope you know I never meant to hurt you." I looked at this man I'd shared nearly half a century with, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. "I know you didn't mean to, Richard, but you did hurt me. And more importantly, you never cared enough to notice how much." 6 months later, I was kneeling in my new garden, planting tomatoes and peppers and herbs that would flourish in the summer sun, when my phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and my heart jumped the way it always did when my granddaughter called. "Grandma Elena? It's me." "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?" "I'm good. Mommy said I could call you because I wanted to ask you something." "What would you like to ask?" "Could I come visit you at your new house? Mommy said it has a garden and that you might teach me how to grow flowers." I closed my eyes and felt tears of joy rather than pain for the first time in almost a year. "I would love that more than anything, Emma. More than anything in the world." As I hung up the phone and returned to my planting, I realized that I'd learned something profound over these past months. I'd spent 47 years believing that love meant sacrifice, that devotion required self-erasure, that being a good woman meant making myself smaller so others could feel larger. But I'd been wrong. Love without respect isn't love at all. It's servitude. Devotion without reciprocity isn't devotion. It's exploitation. And being a good woman doesn't mean disappearing into other people's needs and wants and expectations. Being a good woman means knowing your own worth and insisting that others recognize it too. I was 68 years old, and I was finally learning how to be Elena. Not Elena the wife, or Elena the mother, or Elena the grandmother, but Elena the woman who deserved to take up space in her own life, who had stories to tell and dreams to pursue and love to give on her own terms. And for the first time in decades, that felt like enough. That felt like everything.